Okay, welcome to podcast 40. In this podcast, we are going to be looking at the piles of evidence that exist that point to the idea that evolution is the best explanation for the evidence that science can give us about the incredible diversity of life we have on the planet, about what we see when we look outside our window. So the evidence that we have that points to evolution comes from five major areas, and you can see them listed here on the slide: biogeography, fossil records, so on. We're going to look at each of these one at a time. So let's get started. Biogeography. It's a big word, but it's not a really difficult word. It just refers to the distribution of species on the planet, where living things are found. Where are they found? And then what does this tell us, especially with regard to evolution? Biogeography, the science of biogeography, allows biologists to do a really important thing if a scientific idea is to have any weight behind it, and that is it allows scientists to develop testable predictions, hypotheses that can be tested. Otherwise, it's really hard for something to be testable by the scientific method if you can't develop a question, a prediction that you ought to be able to test and either say, yes, this points in the right direction, or no, it doesn't. So, an example of a testable prediction that biogeography allows us to make with regard to evolution. If evolution occurs, then what we would expect to see is that species that are generally closely related ought to be living generally near each other, unless there's some reason for them not to be, such as they move. I mean, think of it this way. You and your family probably live, or it's likely that you might live near each other. Maybe your parents didn't move too far away from your grandparents, and you live with your parents, and you all kind of live near each other, unless one of you got a job somewhere and flew off and lived in California. Generally speaking, you live near your family members because you are all related. Evolutionary theory suggests that the same would be true for related animal species. They would probably tend to show up together in the same geographic areas, those that are more closely related than others. The flip side of that is that if what we found instead was that species were essentially found in a random geographic manner across the planet, with nobody that is particularly closely related to each other living particularly near each other, just randomly distributed, then that would be fairly strong evidence that evolution wasn't true, that organisms maybe had just been put here individually. They didn't arise from some common ancestor out from a single point in time. What we do find, though, is that biogeography tends to hold true. Darwin's finches, for example, are more closely related to finches that are nearby on mainland South America than they are to finches anywhere else in the world, than to North American finches, for example. Why aren't Darwin's finches just as closely related to finches in North America or China or wherever else they may have finches? Because they did not descend from those finches most recently. They most recently descended from those finches that were on the coast of South America. Okay? It makes sense if they are related to those South American finches that are reasonably close by them. Okay? Um, if organisms, on the contrary, were separately placed into suitable environments, then we would expect to see similar genetics between desert dwellers, regardless of their location. So, for example, we might expect to see desert South American organisms being more closely related to desert dwellers in the Sahara Desert, for example, perhaps, or at least not see any relationship at all. Instead, what we see is that desert animals in South America are actually genetically similar, more similar to the tropical South American animals that have a completely different environment than they are with desert animals from other continents. Why? Because one of these groups of animals on South America gave rise to the other, even though superficially they may look very different because they inhabit very different environments. One group likely gave rise to the other, and thus they are, even though they're quite different, they are more genetically related than South American desert animals are to other desert animals around the world. Another question let's ponder. How come there's not very many placental mammals found in Australia? What we see in Australia are these guys. These are marsupials, okay? And their young are raised in a pouch rather than inside the mother's body. Is it because Australia is inhospitable to placental mammals and they are selected against there as opposed to here? And the answer to that is an unequivocal no. Introduced placental mammals just are considered invasive species. They do extraordinarily well in Australia when humans bring them there. Dogs, cats, they explode. Their populations do very well. What explains then why were there so many marsupials and no placental mammals until humans began introducing them? What explains that is that Australian marsupials evolved in isolation from places where placental mammals lived. And that speaks to plate tectonics, the movement of the plates of land around the planet. Initially, okay, let's say this is Australia. I know that does not look anything like Australia, but Australia, Antarctica, South America were once all joined. In fact, the whole continental mass was joined in one huge mass called Pangaea. Well, marsupials were very common down here, and in fact, these were separated by a little strip of water that came through. Placental mammals up north, okay, in North America. As the continents began to separate, Australia goes off by itself, carrying its marsupial population with them. But when this land bridge forms between North and South America, placentals and marsupials can compete, and guess who outcompetes every time when that competition is held? Placental mammals take over. They're much better equipped to survive than marsupial mammals are. But no placental mammals here because Australia separated from the continent years and years and years ago, before placental mammals came down into South America and started competing. Biogeography has a lot of tales to tell us. So, again, these patterns really don't make sense if species were just individually placed at one time, all at the same time, into their environments. If they were placed that way, we'd expect their genetics to show no particular relationship to nearby organisms. But what the patterns that we see do make sense if species are where they are because they evolved from ancestors that once inhabited those regions or at least somewhere nearby. Okay? The fossil record. The fossil record is just an incredible piece of just physical, look at this evidence suggesting that evolution explains a whole lot. Of course, we know that sedimentary rocks contain often contain fossils. Animals die, they sink to the bottom of a body of water and land on the sediments. Then they are covered up with more sediments and then more dead animals on top and so on. So eventually what you have is layers and layers and layers. The oldest organisms at the bottom, the more recent, younger organisms at the top. And you eventually, over time, create a record of the living things that exist. And what we see in these layers is a succession of organisms that have populated the Earth. Organisms like this, for example. Now, what we see bears out what you would think if evolution was the case. The most ancient rocks show fewer species. But what's more than that is the species they show are much more simple than species that are in later, younger rocks. Younger rocks show more species and importantly, increasing complexity of those species. And that's in agreement with other evidence we see. The oldest rocks show only prokaryote fossils, single-celled, bacterial-like, extremely simple fossil life. The eukaryotes do not show up until much later in the fossil record, and more complex forms from that much later still. The fossil record shows us additionally, if we want to just focus on vertebrate animals, because we're really interested in them. We love to talk about fish and amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals. The fossil record shows us that they did not all appear at once in the fossil record. They appeared one after the other. Fish are the first to appear, and we see nothing else until many years later when we begin to see amphibians, and then after that we begin to see reptiles, and after that we begin to see mammals and then birds. Fish predate all other vertebrates, suggesting that one group evolved from the other. Okay? So the fossil record and this important idea of testable predictions then. Well, we've already talked about some testable predictions, but if the fossil record exists, then, and these organisms that we just spoke of, these vertebrates, for example, if fish did give rise to amphibians, and amphibians did give rise to reptiles, and reptiles did give rise to birds and mammals, then you would expect in the fossil record to be able to find organisms that are somewhere in between a fish and an amphibian, some in-between thing, or something in between an amphibian and a reptile, or in between a reptile and a bird, or something in between. Well, actually, no, because they separate off different lines, sorry. But you should be able to see something called transitional forms. The old days, people used to call them missing links. And many people that want to fight against this idea of evolution say, oh, where are the transitional forms? Where are the missing links? And we have certainly found many of them. In fact, Archaeopteryx is just a phenomenal fossil. If you look at this animal, something ought to strike you if you look at it carefully right away, and that is in the rock next to the bones are clearly the outlines of feathers on this animal's wings, and feathers here. Now, Archaeopteryx is about 150 million years old when it lived, and scientists believe, obviously coloration and so on is somebody's best guess, but the bone structure allows us to know pretty much about what this animal looked like, and it probably looked very much like that. It is an intermediate form between reptiles and birds. You obviously should be able to see the bird characteristics here. What's reptilian? Well, these clawed finger-like structures, for one thing. You can't really see that from this picture, but the skull has teeth, whereas birds do not. This long tail, which has a vertebral column in it. Birds today, modern birds, have long tail feathers very often, but this vertebral column does not exist. This vertebral tail exists, and that's a very reptilian characteristic. So this is clearly this quasi in-between reptiles and birds. Did birds come from Archaeopteryx? No, it's not thought that this is necessarily the ancestor of birds, but it is a transitional form that existed in this time when that kind of evolutionary change was taking place. And if you look at this little animation here, you can kind of see what they think might have looked like as it was flying. Whales. Whales are obviously aquatic mammals. They're completely adapted to life in the water. They do not come out of the water except for by accident. However, it has been thought, due to fossil bones found of a skull of an ancient animal that had a peculiar skull feature that is found only in whales. Whales were linked to an animal that looked very much like this dog-like structure. We knew animals were mammals. They have mammary glands. They have all the mammalian characteristics, or almost all. They don't have much fur, but they are mammals. So how could this mammals, which arose on land, be in the water? Well, it was thought that some land animal secondarily evolved back into the water. Where is the fossil evidence for this? Well, we get this original animal that seems to have a whale-like feature in its skull, and it's very much a dog-like creature. Okay, so but where are the transitional animals? Where are they to prove this? Well, there is an extraordinarily complete fossil record now that leads us to this conclusion. We have just about every organism that would take us from this ancestral dog-like creature to these gigantic animals that we today call whales, secondarily evolving back into the water. I think this guy that you're seeing this color picture of here is probably this one, or maybe that one. I think it's probably this one. So, very, very complete fossil record there. Tiktaalik rosier. Scientists for years speculated what the organism might look like that first came up out of the water. If fish were our first vertebrates, then what did the ancestor look like that might have been the first animal to come out of the water and live on land, even if only for brief periods of time? And scientists would draw pictures of what they thought it might look like. They made predictions about what they thought it might look like. Well, in 2006, a scientist went where he thought the right time in the rocks would be to find such a fossil, and he found it. And come to find out, these are the bones, or a casting of the bones that he found, and this is an artist's depiction of the animal based on these bones, and it looks exactly like what scientists pictured it would look like. A prediction that was borne out by evidence when they went looking for it. This is the transition organism moving from fish to amphibian. How do they know this? Well, everything, or much of it, is right here in this limb bone. They are seeing in the bones of the limb bones that are very similar to vertebrate limbs. And it is thought that this is really the key feature. This animal was able to have strong enough limbs to haul itself out onto land for at least brief periods of time to escape a predator or for whatever reason. Okay? The fossil record is extraordinarily complete, given the unlikelihood that anything's going to be made into a fossil in the first place. When animals die, they are usually eaten, and there's nothing left to become fossilized. So that anything gets fossilized at all is amazing. That we actually find it is more amazing still. That we have the complete fossil record we do is extraordinary. Of course, there are still gaps in it because most animals don't get fossilized. One of the animal fossil records that is the most complete in the world is that of our modern horse. We have a very, very, very clear picture of the steps that we took, or that nature took, getting from the horse's ancestor, this little fox-size organism called Hyracotherium, a fox-like animal, herbivorous, not like a fox, a carnivore, but about that size, going through many dead ends. You can see dead end, dead end, dead end, but ultimately getting us to our very large horse that we see today. The fossil record is clear about the structure of the hoof, going from a multi-toed structure to the single-toed structure. The teeth can be seen changing from one organism to the next through time. The fossil record is extraordinarily complete for horses. All right, another branch of science that's really important in providing evidence for evolutionary biology is comparative anatomy, which is simply looking at this animal and saying, what features do they have that are similar? What features do they have that aren't similar? How related are these animals based on their similar features? And that's a very natural comparison to make. We make it all the time when we're looking at different organisms. Species that tend to be grouped in the same taxonomic category, for example, mammals, tend to have lots of similarities. And the more closely related they are, the more similar their body structures are. That just makes intuitive sense. You should know this term, homologous structures. All right. Homologous structures. Really, really important concept for you to understand in terms of comparative anatomy. Basically, homologous structures are anatomical similarities, structural similarities in an organism that are the result of sharing a common ancestor. So let's look at a good example of homologous structures. Here is your human arm. You have a humerus, you have two bones in your forearm, your radius and ulna, you have wrist bones called carpals, and you have metacarpals and phalanges making up your fingers. So humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, and then metacarpals and phalanges. In a cat, in a limb that looks pretty different, they don't wiggle their fingers like we do. Nonetheless, you've got a humerus, a radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And a whale. Now, a whale's limb looks nothing like yours. It is this one long flipper used for paddling. Nonetheless, if you dissect that limb, what you find, a humerus, a radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Why on earth would a whale have what essentially is a hand inside that flipper? There's no need for it, except for the fact that its ancestors had digits before it, and so we see the remains of these digits in the descendants from that ancestor. A bat, humerus, radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, but it's not using its metacarpals and phalanges to write with like you do. It is using them to spread a membrane across its arm so that it can fly. Incredibly different use for that feature, but the bones in it are the same. Why? Because this was the best possible design for a flying creature? Maybe, but probably not. Probably because its ancestors had these bones, and so natural selection worked with what it had, as this animal, as it favored animals that could fly and occupy a certain niche in their environment. Okay. Um, the forelimbs of all those animals have wildly different functions. It really doesn't make any sense, if you think about it, to say that the best way to design a whale's fin for swimming was to have 5 fingers or 4 fingers underneath a fin. That's the ideal structure. It's not. Fish don't have that, and they swim fantastically. But what does make sense is that it is likely its ancestors had those bones, and as that animal became natural selection sculpted it to be adapted to a water environment, natural selection worked with what it had. Common ancestry. All those animals were descended from some animal that had those fundamental bone structures, and they went in different directions to be adapted for different environments. Okay, so fantastic examples here of homologous structures, structures that are similar, they have a similar development, but they have wildly different functions. Maybe they superficially don't look similar, but their homology, their similarity is visible if you look more closely. And it's evidence of a reasonably close evolutionary relationship, a fairly recent common ancestor. Animals are not the only place we see homology. We see it in plants too. This, of course, is a leaf, but so are those. Those are leaves. They don't really look anything alike. They're quite different. Those are leaves modified for desert plants to hold water. Those are leaves. They don't look like leaves, but they are modified leaves made to be thorns. Those don't look like leaves, but they are. They are modified for a different purpose, though, for clinging on to other structures. Those are leaves. Those are highly modified, colorful leaves that are for attracting pollinators, not for doing photosynthesis. So all of those are homologous structures. Now, homology is not to be confused with analogy or analogous structures. Analogous structures are structures that superficially look kind of similar. They may superficially do the same things, but if you look down deep into the structure, you don't see the structural similarity that you do with a homologous set of structures. So they have similar functions, similar external form, but different internal structures, which is due to a very different origin for each of the structures. And bottom line is, analogous structures do not show an evolutionary ancestry, an evolutionary relationship between organisms. What they do show is natural selection's tendency to solve a similar problem in a similar way. If it benefits an animal to be able to get off the ground for a little bit, the natural selection favors that, and we end up with these broad, flat structures that look like wings. Regardless if we start out as a vertebrate or an invertebrate, the natural selection tends to arrive at a similar solution for both of these wildly unrelated animals. Okay, so just because things look similar on the surface does not mean they are a close relationship. A dragonfly and a hawk are not very closely related at all in terms of life. They are fairly far apart in the evolutionary tree, but natural selection kind of arrived at the same solution for both of those organisms. Something like that is called convergent evolution. This is also an important phrase. Convergent evolution is when you have two organisms that may not be particularly closely related, but because of the environment in which they live, natural selection begins to sculpt them in similar ways so that they end up looking sort of similar, even though they're not particularly closely related. Fish and dolphins are a great example of this. Fish are reasonably closely related to each other, and they have features, fins, a streamlined body, and so on that we associate with them being able to survive very well in the water. Well, dolphins are mammals, and they are not as closely related to fish as fish are to each other. But they superficially look very, very much like fish. Why? Because natural selection sculpted them similarly because of the environment in which they found themselves living. So there's similar adaptations to life in water. And they result in superficially similar looking animals, but they aren't really all that closely related. So the fins and the sleek or hydrodynamic bodies, if you will, those are all analogous structures. They look similar and they do similar things, but they do not necessarily indicate a close relationship. Parallel evolution is essentially evolution it's essentially convergent evolution, but it's occurring in two niches that are not necessarily close by each other, but they are very similar niches. For example, North America, Australia, we can find really similar kinds of environmental conditions in North America and Australia. In North America, however, in a forest niche, we have these things that we might call flying squirrels if we saw them. They're actually gliders. In a similar environment in Australia, we don't have flying squirrels because flying squirrels are placental mammals, but what we do have are marsupial mammals called sugar gliders. They look superficially very similar to flying squirrels, but they are not that closely related because they're marsupials, not placental mammals, and they're fairly, as far as mammals go, fairly distantly related. So parallel evolution is basically filling similar ecological roles. Organisms are filling these similar roles in similar environments. Again, natural selection ends up with kind of the same result, even though the animals are not particularly closely related to each other. Okay? There's all kinds of examples from Australia versus, placental mammals. There's a burrower that you all are probably familiar with where we live, called a mole. It crawls around underground. It has almost no eyes, really big front feet for digging. There's a really similar animal in Australia. It's a marsupial, though. It's not a placental mammal, and thus fairly distantly related. But gosh, look at their body shapes and look at their front claws and so on. They are very, very similar in their structures. So, and there's lots of examples of these. Okay. Vestigial organs. If we look at animals, we find that many animals have organs that really don't have a purpose. Structures probably would be a better term than organs. You have a tailbone that is essentially useless. Why would you have a useless organ? Why would any animal have a useless organ? Why do we see so many of them? Because they weren't useless a long time ago. A long time ago, some ancestor of ours had a use for this structure, but over time, as natural selection acted on us, as we moved into different environments, that structure was less and less important, and natural selection no longer favored it, and so it began to go away. Great example, in whales, we still see in baleen whales remnants of hind legs that indicate their former terrestrial background. In certain fish, these cave fish, they have vestigial eye structures. They can't see. There is an eye remnant where their eye, there you can even see it better on that guy, I think. they have no use for an eye because they live underground where there is no light. But their ancestors didn't always live there. They used to have functioning eyes, but natural selection didn't favor keeping this functioning eye underwater because in the caves because there was no light there. So vestigial organs are remnants of structures that were once functional, but bad, deleterious just means bad mutations accumulate in genes in these structures because they're no longer critical. If this fish wound up in a cave and it had offspring that had a mutation that made their eyes go bad, who cares? Because they live in a cave. So that mutation wouldn't get us selected against. It would just kind of accumulate and be passed on. And the next thing you know, natural selection might be favoring this animal because it's not wasting biological resources creating a functioning eye. So deleterious mutations accumulate without reducing fitness for the animal. Okay. The pelvic, okay, eyes on black, okay, human tailbone. Okay, this is a great shot. This is, I don't know if this is in one of the natural history museums in DC or looks like National Geographic here, but this is those rudimentary vestigial hind limb bones shown in the skeleton of a whale. They're not the only ones. Certain snakes still show vestiges of hind limbs. You can see the bones here for these spurs that are the remnants of hind limb bones in certain snakes. Not all snakes have that. Comparative embryology. Superficially, a fish, a reptile, a bird, and a human, if you look at them in their adult form, they look pretty different. But if you look at them in their embryonic state, it is often very difficult to even tell them apart because they look so much alike and have incredibly similar structures. For example, fish, reptiles, birds, and humans all have gill slits. All have gill slits in their early days as embryos. They also all have tails in their early days as embryos. Why? They don't all have them when they grow up. The fact the fish is the only one that actually has gills when it grows up. All these other organisms are breathing with lungs. Why? Well, they came from a common ancestor, and that common ancestry is revealed when we are able to see into the embryonic development. These gill slits turn into other things in these animals as they mature. They stay as gills in fish. Natural selection worked with what it had and turned it into different things. Natural selection pressures turned those gill slits into different things for land-dwelling animals. Okay? Comparative embryology then basically is able to reveal to us homologies that are not visible in adult forms of animals. Okay? Finally, molecular biology gives us some of the most concrete evidence there is to suggest that evolution has occurred on our planet. You would expect your DNA to be more similar to your parents' DNA than it is to your cousin's DNA because you are more closely related to your parents than you are to your cousins. We would expect that the DNA of two closely related species to be more similar than to species that are not closely related for the same exact reasons. That's a prediction we can make and did make. And then as we examine DNA and proteins, we find that that prediction is supported. For example, let's look at hemoglobin. This is looking at the hemoglobin protein, but of course that is based on the DNA structure. We know that proteins are coded for by DNA. In a human, the hemoglobin protein is made up of 146 amino acids. In a rhesus monkey, 8 of those amino acids are different from a human. And a mouse, which we would expect to be not quite so closely related to us, it's not as similar to us, it has more differences. And a chicken, more differences still. And a frog, more differences still. And a lamprey, which is a very, very ancient fish organism, the amino acids for hemoglobin are more different still. This is exactly what natural selection, what evolution would predict if evolution has occurred, that more closely related organisms would have similar DNA, similar proteins, less closely related would have more different DNA and more different proteins. Okay? All right. Finally, all life has a common genetic code. That really should be pretty overwhelming evidence that all life is in fact related. That language of that genetic code has been passed to every organism that we have found so far on planet Earth. The same basic code works for all of them. All right, that's it for the evidence for evolution, and I will see you at the next podcast.